Welcome to our course, Frank Lloyd Wright in the 20th Century. My name is John Lobel. I'm a professor of architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. I studied architecture at the University of Pennsylvania with such architects as Louis Kahn and Robert Venturi, and I wrote a book on Louis Kahn's philosophy titled Between Silence and Light. So, why a course on Frank Lloyd Wright? Wright is generally recognized as one of the most important architects of the 20th century. Let's briefly list some of the reasons for this assessment. First, many of his buildings are simply beautiful. To this day, many who own Frank Lloyd Wright houses find them an absolute joy to live in. But more importantly, we will see as we make our way through this course that Wright was at the center of many of the defining moments of the 20th century. We see his ideas reflected in modern art, for example in Cubism and in Mondrian. In literature, we see reflections of his ideas in the novels of James Joyce, Marcel Proust, and Virginia Woolf. And in physics, we see parallels between Wright's approach and Einstein's theory of relativity. And finally, Wright developed an approach that he called organic architecture, which includes a deep relationship between the building and nature, an idea of growing importance today as we recognize the importance of sustainability. Wright was born in 1867 and died in 1959. So he lived to the age of 91, and his life spanned the end of the 19th century and the entire first half of the 20th century. He was born just 2 years after the end of the American Civil War, and by the time he died, we were in the modern world of electronic communications, atomic energy, and satellites. He responded to that world, but he also held on to the values of the Emersonian world in which he had been born. We notice that the first house that Wright did on his own, the Winslow House, has stables in the back. And one of his last projects, the Illinois, a proposal for a mile-high tower in 1956, was to have atomic-powered elevators. So we see this huge span in the development of technology that he lived through. Wright's career was long, and he was responsible for over 500 completed projects located throughout almost all of the United States. After some early houses, he developed his prairie style, as we see in his Roby House of 1909 in Chicago. Here we see the low-sloped overhanging roof, open plan, interpenetration of inside and outside, and massive chimney core that will come to characterize the American suburban home of the 1950s and 60s. In the 1920s, he did a series of concrete tile houses, beginning with the Millard House in Pasadena, California. Here he shows us the concrete construction of the house, in contrast, for example, to Le Corbusier's use of stucco to cover the structural tiles in his Villa Savoie. Now, Wright's career was so long that it had major ups and downs. He could go as long as a decade without getting a single commission. And after a long drought, in 1935, he got the commission to do Falling Water in Bear Run, Pennsylvania, which completely relaunched his career and brought him to world recognition. Around the same time, he did the Johnson Wax headquarters, which presented a totally new vision of the modern workplace. And finally, in the 1950s, he did a series of remarkable projects culminating in the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. And the Guggenheim was the final manifestation of his vision of space. He wrote, "Space, the continual becoming, invisible fountain from which all rhythms flow and to which they must pass, beyond time or infinity. Wright was born about 150 years ago, and throughout this course we'll be asking, what can we learn from Wright about how we should engage with the technology and culture of our time? So Wright responded to the new technologies of his time, particularly concrete. Then we should ask, what are the cutting-edge materials of our time, and how should the architecture of today respond to them? Wright's prairie style was a response to changes in family life and to the emergence of the American suburb. What are the corresponding changes in our time, and how should our architecture respond to them? Wright's work influenced modern art. What is the relationship of today's architecture to today's art? And there are parallels between Wright's architecture and Einstein's relativity. Both are dependent on the motion of the observer. But that was the physics of 100 years ago. What is the physics of today, and how does it relate to our architecture today? In looking at Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum of 1959 in New York City, and Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum of 1997 in Bilbao, Spain, we can ask, what was Wright's relationship to the 20th century, and how should we today be relating to our emerging 21st century? So those are the questions we'll be asking in this course, and I look forward to working with you.